It began with the sound of church bells that no one remembered ringing. The morning mist rolled down from the Appalachian ridges, swallowing the small mining town of Darsen, Pennsylvania, in a pale, ghost-like fog. It was late autumn, 1930, when coal dust still clung to every window, and silence had become a language of its own. People didn't talk much here. They said the town was tired, that its heart had been buried long before the mines closed. But those who lived in Darsen whispered of something else, a secret buried deeper than coal, one the earth itself seemed unwilling to release. At the edge of the main road stood an abandoned house, its paint peeled to the grain, its shutters hanging loose like old eyelids. Children once ran past it, daring each other to touch the rusted gate, claiming they heard someone humming from inside. But the adults never scolded them for it. They simply looked away, pretending not to hear, because they too had grown used to that faint sound like a woman's voice beneath the floorboards. Our story begins with a man named Elias Moore, a coal foreman who had worked the mines until his lungs gave out. He was the kind of man who never believed in stories. But one night after the last shift whistle blew, Elias didn't go home. He wandered toward the North Quarry where the ground had long since caved in. He carried a lantern and a worn map of the old tunnels, tracing lines that no longer existed. Some said he was looking for a lost payroll chest from the mining company. Others whispered he was searching for his brother, who had vanished years earlier during a collapse no one talked about. When they found his lantern the next morning, the glass was cracked, still warm to the touch. The handle was covered in black soot, but there was no sign of Elias. Only a trail of footprints leading toward the abandoned section of town where the old church stood. The prints ended abruptly, as if the man had been swallowed whole by the earth. In the following days, the town fell under an unspoken spell. People began locking their doors before sunset, not because they feared whoever or whatever had taken Elias, but because they feared what they might remember if they stayed out too long. There were reports of faint lights flickering underground, voices heard near the church well, and once, a miner's child claimed he saw Elias standing in the fog, tapping on his window with blackened fingers. The sheriff tried to calm the panic. He sent a team to search the quarry, then the church grounds, but no one went farther than the stone steps. The air there was heavy, thick with the smell of wet iron. Beneath the church lay catacombs built in the 1800s, storage for coal, then bodies, when the influenza came. Most had forgotten those tunnels existed, but the old pastor hadn't. He said the town owed a debt to the dead, and that debt had finally come due. It would have been easy to dismiss him as another old man lost in grief, except that the strange happenings didn't stop. By midwinter, 2 more townspeople had disappeared, both last seen near the same church. One was a widow who cleaned the pews. The other, a young teacher who had just arrived from Pittsburgh. The teacher's diary was found later in a field, its pages stiff with rain. Her last entry read, "The people here dig graves that never stay filled." That sentence spread through Darsen like a sickness. The mayor ordered the church sealed, its doors nailed shut, its windows boarded. But a week later, someone or something had pried the boards loose from the inside. The sheriff gathered a small search party and entered. They found pews overturned, hymnals scattered, and at the altar, the ground had been disturbed, as if someone had been trying to dig their way out. The report filed afterward was short. It listed no names, no conclusions, only one line: the town must remain quiet, and so it did. For decades, the remaining families stayed, unwilling or unable to leave. The mines closed, the roads crumbled, and Darsen slowly vanished from maps, as though someone had erased it on purpose. Today, if you drive north through Pennsylvania's forgotten mining belt, you might pass through where it once stood. You'll see the outline of a bell tower in the fog, the faint trace of a road swallowed by weeds. Locals will tell you nothing ever happened there, that the ground was unstable and the people moved away. But sometimes, when the wind shifts, you can still hear those bells ringing faintly through the mist, like a warning, or a memory that refuses to die. And maybe that's what Darsen really was, not a town, but a memory trying to stay buried. A secret so old and heavy that even the earth could not contain it. To understand what happened in Darsen, we have to go back to the beginning, to the rise of Pennsylvania's coal frontier, when the promise of black rock drew men from across the world. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the valleys of Pennsylvania were a living machine of smoke, sweat, and iron. Small towns sprouted beside the veins of coal like fungi after rain. Temporary places, built from timber and desperation. Darsen was one of them, founded in 1879 by a mining company no one remembers now, one that disappeared just as quickly as it rose. The town was small, no more than a few dozen houses surrounding the main shaft entrance. The mine was its heartbeat, its curse, and its only source of life. Men worked 16-hour shifts underground while their wives kept the homes above clean, their children playing in the soot, learning early that every breath carried dust. Coal was both wealth and death here. You could feed your family with it, but it would also fill your lungs until you couldn't breathe. By 1900, Pennsylvania produced more than half of America's coal supply, but prosperity never reached places like Darsen. The big cities, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, took the profits. The miners took the graves. Life was measured not in years, but in accidents survived. The explosion of 1902 killed 19 men. The cave-in of 1905 swallowed 8 more. In a town of barely 300, those numbers meant everything. Still, people stayed. They built their homes, raised children, and prayed every Sunday in the small wooden church that stood on the hill. That church would later become the center of everything, the place where hope and horror intertwined. Religion was complicated in mining towns. For many, it was the only comfort they had. But in Darsen, faith was less about salvation and more about bargaining. Miners believed the earth beneath them was alive, hungry even, and that their prayers were offerings to keep it calm. They carved crosses into beams underground, whispered blessings before detonating charges, and left coins near the tunnels where deaths had occurred. When a man died below, his name was never spoken near the entrance again. It was believed his spirit stayed down there, pacing the dark, waiting for someone to remember him. By 1910, the first signs of decay had begun. The company that owned the mine started pulling out equipment, cutting wages, and importing cheaper labor. Immigrant families arrived, Polish, Slovak, Irish, each bringing their own superstitions, their own ways of coping with death. Darsen became a patchwork of accents and beliefs, united only by exhaustion. The old families resented the newcomers. Fights broke out in taverns. One man was found beaten near the rail yard and no one claimed to have seen a thing. The 1920s changed everything. The First World War had ended, but the economy was cracking. Coal demand dropped, and with it, the town's last illusion of stability. Men were laid off in waves. Some left quietly in the night, abandoning their homes. Others turned to drinking, their pay slips replaced by bottles. The air of the town shifted. It became still, like the pause before a storm. And that was when the first strange events began to surface. Old records from the local paper, the Darsen Gazette, last published in 1927, mention unexplained disappearances of livestock, whispers of lights beneath the ground, and what one reporter called unaccountable tremors. The town's pastor, Reverend Howard Wicks, held special midnight services to calm the spirit of the valley. People attended not because they believed him, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. Around this time, folklore took hold. Stories spread about the black tunnels, the old sections of the mine that had been sealed off years before. It was said that during the Great Collapse of 1899, when a pocket of gas ignited and killed 14 miners, not all of the bodies were recovered. Some were entombed alive, buried behind walls of rock. According to local legend, they kept digging long after the rescue crews had given up. Generations of children were warned not to go near the old quarry, not because of danger, but because the miners down there never stopped working. By 1925, the mine had officially shut down. The company left, leaving only a ghost town clinging to its ruins. Yet the residents, who remained mostly widows, the elderly, and a few stubborn men, refused to abandon what little they had. They believed the town could come back to life. But Darsen had already begun its slow descent into memory. Culturally, this was an era when rural America was fading. The Roaring Twenties meant jazz, automobiles, and electric lights for the cities. But for isolated places like Darsen, modernity felt like something happening on another planet. The roads were unpaved, the nights absolute in their darkness, and the only connection to the outside world was a telegraph line that often went dead in storms. It's important to understand the mindset of people living there. They didn't separate the spiritual from the physical. When tragedy struck, it wasn't, "Why did this happen?" but "What did we do wrong?" When sickness came, they didn't call it infection, they said the earth was punishing them. When a child went missing, they didn't look for criminals, they looked for curses. In 1928, the town's records show a sudden drop in births and a spike in deaths from respiratory complications. Coal dust had become part of their bloodstream. But doctors from nearby counties who visited Darsen wrote of something stranger. Patients complaining of nightmares so vivid they refused to sleep. Entire families describing the same vision of people walking beneath the ground. One physician, Dr. Raymond Lyle, noted in his 1929 report that several patients insisted they could hear whispers rising from their floorboards at night. When he asked where they thought the voices came from, they always gave the same answer: below. That's where the town's collective memory begins to twist. By 1930, when Elias Moore disappeared, Darsen was already half abandoned. Buildings sagged under the weight of neglect. The mine entrances were sealed, but the ground often shifted, as if something underneath was still moving. In that state of isolation, folklore became fact. People believed the mine had become a tomb not for men, but for something older. Some said it was cursed land, others believed it was sacred. Either way, they treated it like a living thing. When the disappearances began again that autumn, no one called the state police. No one sent telegrams for help. They just buried their fear under silence, the same way their fathers had buried their dead under coal. And that silence, more than anything, became Darsen's legacy, a silence that grew so vast and heavy that it eventually erased the town itself. The first disappearance was quiet, almost forgettable. Elias Moore, a foreman who had worked the mine since boyhood, failed to return home one evening in early autumn of 1930. His wife, Clara, assumed he'd stayed late at the tavern. When he didn't come home by morning, she went looking for him. The bartender said Elias had left before midnight, walking the usual dirt path behind the shuttered mill. His lantern was found 2 days later, half buried in mud near the old quarry entrance. The glass wasn't cracked, the flame had simply died out. No one spoke of it much. Men had gone missing before wandered off drunk, found work elsewhere, or met worse fates in the woods. But the next week, when Samuel Reed, the preacher's son, disappeared on the same road, the town's thin patience began to fray. Samuel had been returning from evening service, carrying hymn sheets in a tin box. That box was later found bent and rusted, as though crushed by something heavy. The people of Darsen began to whisper again about the tunnels. Some said they had heard distant knocking under their homes at night, like someone striking the earth with a hammer. Others swore they saw light moving beneath the ground, flickering through cracks in the soil near the quarry, as though the mine had come alive. Reverend Wicks tried to calm them with scripture, urging everyone to stay together and pray. But even he seemed shaken. He'd started locking the church at dusk, something he'd never done before. Clara Moore, desperate and pale, insisted she saw her husband's figure at the edge of the forest one evening, his clothes torn, his face blackened with soot. When she called out, the figure turned away and vanished between the trees. She fainted before reaching home. Within weeks, 3 more people were gone. A boy named Henry, who worked at the general store, Mrs. Amos, the widow who lived near the river, and old Ben Rowley, who claimed to hear voices calling his name from his cellar. Each disappearance happened without a trace. No footprints, no struggle, just absence. By the end of November, fear had turned the town into something unrecognizable. People nailed their doors shut at night. Windows were boarded, wells were sealed. No one walked the streets after dark. The sound of silence was thicker than smoke. And yet every now and then, someone would swear they heard singing from the direction of the quarry, low, mournful, and rhythmic, like a work chant echoing from the deep. A group of men eventually decided to investigate. They carried lanterns and shovels, muttering prayers as they approached the old mine. The entrance had long been blocked by planks and earth, but the ground looked freshly disturbed. When they dug into it, they found that the soil was warm, as if something beneath had been burning. One of them, Thomas Avery, touched the wood and pulled back instantly, claiming it felt like skin. The others laughed uneasily, but none stayed long enough to prove him wrong. The next morning, Thomas was gone. His lantern was discovered on his porch, still lit. The wick hadn't burned down. After that, even the bravest refused to speak of the mine. Reverend Wicks organized nightly vigils, praying for protection, but attendance dwindled as fear replaced faith. Then, one stormy night in December, the Reverend himself disappeared. The church door was found open, candles still burning. The Bible on the pulpit was open to the book of Job. The page was torn, and beside it, on the wooden floor, was a smear of black dust that led nowhere. It was around this time that strange phenomena became impossible to deny. Livestock were found dead, their bodies oddly arranged as if positioned deliberately, facing the same direction, eyes wide open. Houses trembled with soft vibrations that came from beneath the floorboards, like the heartbeat of something massive and slow. Children complained of hearing humming at night. And one mother swore her baby began crying every time the earth moved. The town's remaining doctor, a man named Elias Kerr, began documenting the events in his notebook. He wrote about the collective hysteria gripping the town, but his notes became more erratic as the days went by. The last entry, dated December 29, 1930, reads, "They are beneath us." Not ghosts, not men. The ground remembers. He disappeared the next morning. By January, Darsen was nearly empty. The few who remained barricaded themselves inside their homes, surviving on canned food and well water. The telegraph line went dead after a lightning strike, cutting them off entirely. When the county finally sent a search team in February, they found only 7 people left. All of them were silent, sitting together in the church with vacant eyes. None spoke a word about what had happened. The rest of the town was abandoned. Doors hung open, dinner plates still on tables, furniture overturned. In some homes, investigators found footprints bare feet, traced in black dust, leading to cellar doors that opened onto solid ground. The official report labeled the event a mass flight due to hysteria, but even the officials who came to clean up refused to stay after sunset. One of them, a man named George Hanley, claimed to hear voices under the floor, calling him by name. He quit the next day and never returned. Over the years, people have speculated endlessly about Darsen's fall. Some blame methane leaks from the abandoned tunnels. Others point to lead poisoning from the well water. A few suggest it was psychological, a case of mass paranoia in a town already fractured by poverty and superstition. But there are details no science has explained. The warmth of the earth, the singing in the wind, the smell of burning that lingered even in winter. To this day, nothing grows on the land where the mine once stood. The soil is barren, gray, and cracked, as if scorched from beneath. Locals avoid it. Travelers who pass by say the air feels heavy, the silence unnatural. Some even claim to see faint lights flickering underground when the moon is full, and sometimes, when the night is quiet enough, the wind carries a sound like distant hammers striking stone steady, rhythmic and impossibly deep. It's as if the miners never stopped working. When news of Darsen's silence reached the surrounding towns, disbelief was the first reaction. In 1931, rural Pennsylvania was no stranger to hardship. Mines collapsed, workers fled, families vanished into cities chasing the illusion of a better life. So when word spread that an entire town had fallen quiet, people assumed exaggeration. But when a group of rail workers passed near Darsen's edge and found smoke rising from chimneys of empty homes, the story began to shift from rumor to alarm. The first outsiders to enter were county officials and a few volunteers. They found no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, only absence. Meals left half-eaten, fires still smoldering in stoves, a rocking chair moving as if someone had just stood up. Their accounts were so consistent that the county sheriff, Harold Dunn, organized a full search. He brought dogs, lanterns, and 30 men from nearby towns. The dogs refused to enter. They whined, pulled back, and when forced, they lay flat on the ground as if listening for something beneath the soil. The men reported a stench that came and went, metallic and sharp, mixed with something like sulfur. They said the air felt thick, almost damp with heat, even though it was midwinter. Some swore they heard tapping underfoot, slow, deliberate, echoing through the ground. Sheriff Dunn ordered the search halted at sundown. He later told a reporter, "It was the kind of place that made you feel watched, even when you were alone." Within weeks, newspapers picked up the story. The Harrisburg Chronicle ran the headline, "A town swallowed by its own mines." Journalists descended on the area, photographing the decaying streets, the dust-coated furniture, the empty cradle by a cold hearth. Some treated it as a tragedy, others as a curiosity. One reporter from New York called it America's first ghost town born of fear, but none could explain what had truly happened. Relatives of the missing traveled miles to find answers. Mothers searched for sons, wives for husbands. They slept in the church that still smelled faintly of candle wax and ash, hoping someone or something might return. One woman claimed she saw her sister standing at the edge of the quarry at dawn, staring into the mist. When she ran toward her, the figure turned and walked straight into the fog, disappearing before her eyes. Psychologists and clergy were sent by the state to ease the panic. Dr. Julian McBride, a psychiatrist from Philadelphia, wrote a report describing the phenomenon as collective trauma compounded by isolation. He theorized that long exposure to mind gases might have triggered hallucinations and paranoia. His report was published but dismissed by locals as cold and arrogant. He never heard the ground breathe, one surviving resident muttered years later. Churches in nearby counties held joint vigils. Ministers preached that Darsen had been punished for pride, a town built on greed and silence. Others whispered that it was cursed land long before the first shovel struck the earth. Stories began to surface, tales of miners who'd broken an ancient burial ground, or of a slave's bones found deep in the shafts decades earlier. The rumors twisted history into folklore until no one could tell what was truth and what was myth. Economically, the disappearance of Darsen sent ripples through the region. Trade routes closed, investors withdrew, and nearby towns grew suspicious of outsiders. Farmers refused to work the soil too close to the site, fearing contamination or worse. Even in cities far away, the word Darsen became shorthand for something unspoken bad luck. Divine warning, or madness itself. By the time federal investigators arrived, the few survivors were in no condition to speak. They sat together in silence, eyes hollow, hands trembling when asked about the mine. Some eventually broke their silence, offering fragments of memory that contradicted each other. One woman claimed the ground had opened like a mouth. Another said the town had gone underground. A man named Paul Avery simply repeated the same words again and again. They were singing. Medical examinations found nothing unusual, no poisoning, no trauma, only extreme fatigue and dehydration. But the doctors noted something chilling. Each survivor had the same pattern of fine gray dust under their fingernails, though none could explain how it got there. As months passed, Darsen faded from headlines. The depression worsened and people had other horrors to occupy their minds. The government quietly declared the area unsafe, fencing off the quarry and condemning nearby structures. It became a place no one mentioned openly, though everyone knew where it was. Children growing up in nearby towns dared each other to run to the edge of Darsen and listen. Some claimed to hear faint music, as if from a buried choir. By the 1940s, Darsen existed only in memory and cautionary tales. Preachers used it to warn against greed, scientists cited it as a case of hysteria, and storytellers wove it into ghost legends. But for those who'd lost someone there, the grief never settled. Many left flowers at the boundary fence every year on the anniversary of the town's disappearance. The flowers always wilted faster than normal, their stems turning black within hours. There were occasional attempts to excavate the mine again, but none succeeded. Equipment malfunctioned, compasses spun wildly, and crews refused to continue after nightfall. One worker in 1947 reportedly saw a light moving deep underground, like a lantern being carried by invisible hands. For decades, the people who lived within 20 miles of the site spoke of Darsen as if it were still alive. It breathes, they said. It waits. To outsiders, it was nonsense. To them, it was survival instinct, a respect for something vast and buried, something human understanding had no place disturbing. By the 1960s, the land had overgrown with wild grass and pine. Birds avoided it. Hunters said their dogs refused to cross the fence line. A few archaeologists requested permission to study the site, but state officials denied it each time, citing unstable ground. The official silence became its own legend, and so the town's memory was sealed not just by the soil that covered it, but by the silence of those who lived near it. They knew better than to ask what had really happened in 1930. Some truths, they said, are meant to stay buried. In the winter of 1932, nearly a year after Darsen's disappearance, the state finally approved one last investigation. The official reason was geological, an attempt to determine whether the collapse of underground mines could pose a wider risk to nearby towns. But those who joined the expedition admitted privately that curiosity, not safety, drove them there. People wanted closure, or proof, or maybe just a story to make sense of the silence. The team was small, 2 geologists, 3 miners, a doctor, and Sheriff Dunn, who refused to let anyone enter without him. The morning they arrived, the air was perfectly still. Snow covered the remains of houses like a shroud. Every door had rotted off its hinges, and the windows were dark with soot. Dunn noted that no footprints, animal or human, marked the snow within the town's borders, as if nature itself avoided it. They set up camp near the old quarry, where the mine's main shaft gaped open like a wound. The men joked to calm their nerves, but their laughter sounded hollow against the cliffs. When one miner dropped a flare into the pit, it burned for a long time before vanishing into the dark without touching bottom. The descent began at noon. They rigged a winch and lowered themselves slowly, lanterns swaying. The walls were slick with moisture, though it hadn't rained in weeks. The deeper they went, the warmer the air grew, and a faint humming began to rise so soft that at first they mistook it for the sound of the wind in the ropes. But as they descended, the hum became rhythmic, like a low human chant echoing from somewhere below. At 300 feet, they reached a ledge and stepped off the line. The passage beyond was unnaturally smooth, as though carved by careful hands, not blasted by tools. The walls were streaked with black residue that shimmered faintly under the lanterns. Iron oxide, one geologist said at first until he touched it and jerked back. It was warm, pulsing faintly like living tissue. The further they walked, the stronger the humming became. Words began to form within the sound, though none could understand the language. It rose and fell in patterns that made their stomachs twist. One miner, Thomas Reeve, muttered that it sounded like the prayers of people who forgot who they were praying to. After an hour, they entered a large chamber, the heart of the mine. In the center stood a mound of coal dust shaped almost like a small hill. But what froze them was what lay scattered around it. Dozens of miners' helmets, tools, and half-buried in the dust human bones. Not collapsed or crushed, but carefully arranged in a circle, hands clasped as if in prayer. The doctor knelt to examine one skull and whispered, "These aren't decomposed by time, they're burned." Yet no signs of fire marked the surrounding rock. It was as if the heat had come from within the bodies themselves. Then one of the geologists, a man named Carver, noticed something protruding from the mound, a piece of fabric. He brushed away the dust, revealing a tattered sleeve. Beneath it was a shoulder, then a face. The body was perfectly preserved, skin blackened as though soaked in tar, but intact. The mouth was open mid-scream. As they uncovered more, it became clear there were dozens, maybe hundreds of bodies fused together in that mound, as if melted into one another. The chant grew louder, though no one could see its source. The air vibrated, and the lantern flames bent inward, drawn toward the mound. Sheriff Dunn tried to retreat, shouting for everyone to climb back, but the ropes they'd descended on were gone, vanished into the dark above. Panic erupted. The humming turned into something else, then laughter, distorted and distant, echoing through the stone. One of the miners ran toward the tunnel, only to stop dead and whisper, "They're here." From the darkness beyond the chamber, figures began to appear, pale, translucent shapes walking slowly toward them. Men, women, children, the people of Darsen. Their faces were vacant, eyes black with soot, mouths moving silently in rhythm with the chant. They circled the mound, hands brushing the walls, leaving behind streaks of that same shimmering residue. The doctor fainted. Carver dropped his lantern, and when it shattered, the entire chamber erupted in light, not fire, but a blinding white glare that poured from the mound itself. The bodies within began to twitch, fingers clawing at the air, faces contorting as if they were waking. Dunn fired his revolver. The sound was swallowed instantly. He later said he didn't remember climbing back to the surface, only waking at dawn near the edge of the quarry. Frost clinging to his coat, his skin streaked with gray dust. Of the others, only 2 were found alive, both incoherent and blind. The state sealed the mine the next week, filling the shaft with concrete and ordering all records classified. The official report listed the deaths as asphyxiation due to underground gas pockets. But locals whispered a different version, that Dunn and his men had disturbed something ancient. something buried before the town ever existed. In his final years, Dunn never spoke of the event publicly, but he kept a notebook, later found by his grandson in 1968. The last page contained only one sentence, written in a shaky hand. "They were singing beneath us before we came, and they are still singing now." After that winter, the ground around Darsen began to shift again. Sinkholes appeared, swallowing parts of the forest. At night, travelers reported hearing faint music from under the earth, as though hundreds of voices were humming in harmony, deep and slow. Some said the sound carried through the frost and into their dreams. Decades later, when aerial photographs were taken for geological surveys, they revealed something chilling. Faint circular patterns beneath the surface, perfectly symmetrical, radiating outward from where the mine had been. And in the center, barely visible, the outline of what looked like a town. The story of Darsen, Pennsylvania became one of those tales that people half believe, half doubt. The town never reappeared on maps, and most who had lived nearby eventually moved west, taking with them their silence. By the time the interstate highway cut across the valley in the 1960s, there was no trace of houses or roads, just wild grass, cracked foundations, and the faint smell of coal whenever the wind shifted. But those who worked on the highway claimed strange things. Equipment would fail only near the old mine site. Radios picked up fragments of voices that didn't match any known station. One construction foreman swore he saw lanterns moving in the woods at night, slow, steady, as if following the rhythm of a song. When he went to investigate, he found boot prints leading nowhere and a child's shoe half buried in frozen mud. No one could explain how the earth stayed warm there, even in deep winter. Snow melted in perfect circles over the buried shafts, forming dark patches that glowed faintly under moonlight. Scientists dismissed it as a geothermal anomaly, but locals said it was the town still breathing beneath the ground. In 1974, a geology professor from the University of Pittsburgh reopened the case as part of an academic study. His name was Dr. Henry Lowell, a man obsessed with the folklore of forgotten mining towns. He spent 2 weeks in the area, recording ground vibrations and magnetic readings. On his last night, he called his assistant in a panic, saying he'd found something. The line went dead mid-sentence. His car was discovered the next morning near the sealed quarry, engine still running, headlights pointing toward the fog. Dr. Lowell was never found. Only his recorder remained, filled with static except for one brief moment of sound, faint humming, rhythmic, like distant voices repeating a single phrase. The recording was analyzed years later. The hum, when slowed down, formed a pattern, an interval sequence matching the old miners' hymns from the early 1900s. It wasn't words, but it carried structure, almost language. One researcher described it as an imitation of human prayer from something that doesn't remember being human. Since then, the Darsen Valley has been designated off-limits. Government signs warn of unstable terrain and toxic gases, though no leaks have ever been detected. Yet each winter, a few people still make the pilgrimage: historians, thrill-seekers, the kind of wanderers drawn to silence. They walk the perimeter fence and leave small offerings, candles, coins, sometimes old mining lamps. Most return safely. A few never do. One local farmer, now in his 90s, told a documentary crew in 1999 that he once wandered too close during a snowstorm. He said he heard laughter, soft and childlike, drifting through the fog. When he turned, he saw a family standing in the field, a man, a woman, and 2 children holding hands. Their faces were pale, their clothes from another century. They looked directly at him, mouths moving, though no sound came out. When he blinked, they were gone. Only the snow remained, untouched where they had stood. People say stories like that are just echoes grief carried through time. But in the case of Darsen, the evidence lingers. In 2010, ground-penetrating radar used by a documentary team detected hollow spaces beneath the site, symmetrical and interconnected like chambers. When the team returned weeks later to take more scans, the landscape had changed. The ground had collapsed in several places, and the old paths were gone. It was as if the valley itself had rearranged to hide what lay beneath. What happened to Darsen's people remains an open question. Some historians think it was mass hysteria, miners poisoned by carbon monoxide, families fleeing hallucinations. Others believe it was something older, tied to the land before settlers arrived. Indigenous records from the region speak of the ground that sings when disturbed, a place where the dead were never to be buried. Maybe the people of Darsen didn't vanish. Maybe they merged with the thing beneath the same way the mine swallowed the town, the same way the earth hums long after the fire is gone. When night falls over that empty stretch of Pennsylvania, there's no sound but the wind. Yet if you listen closely, really listen, you might hear it. A low vibration under the frost, steady and patient, like a choir buried deep within the soil. Some call it memory, others call it punishment. Whatever it is, it's still singing, and perhaps it always will.